Hi, I'm Marilyn. Welcome to my studio. Do you ever trace your reference image before you transfer it to your watercolor paper? Have you ever been less than satisfied with the results that you get? Well, I'm a watercolor artist and painting people is my thing, and it's a subject where accuracy is important. I like to trace my reference image and transfer it to my watercolor paper when I'm faced with subject matter like a face that requires precision. In this video, I'll share with you how I use Procreate. It's an app from the App Store. How I use that on my iPad with an Apple Pencil to make a line drawing for tracing and transferring. Now, please note, Procreate is for iPad only, and there is a fee. It's $10 at the App Store, but I will say it's probably the best $10 I've ever spent on the App Store. If you're an Android user, you have a different type of tablet, there may be a similar product out there for you. I don't know what that is, so I'm going to leave that research to you. Now, the first step before we even open the Procreate app is to make sure that our reference image, our photograph, is ready to work with. It's on our camera roll, on our phone or iPad, and it's already been edited. I rarely, and I could almost safely say never, work from a photo that I've taken that I have not edited. So if you don't know how to edit on your phone, in other words, you're not sure how to crop, how to resize to the appropriate ratio so that it's right for the paper that size paper you're going to be working on, or you're not sure how to change the image to grayscale or posterize, I suggest that you check out the above article. It's on the online Apple Toolbox, and it's called Editing Photos on Your iPhone. All right, with all of that said, let's get started. We're going to use the Procreate app on my iPad to create a line drawing that will give us a crisp, clean line or contour that we can trace and transfer to watercolor paper. So the first thing is to open the Procreate app. The first page you will see is what Procreate calls the gallery. And my gallery is full. I have a lot of reference images that I've dropped in here because I use them as the basis for drawing practice and portraits. Our job today, first job, is going to be to touch the plus sign in the top right-hand corner, and we're going to create a new canvas, a blank canvas. You have a variety of sizes to use, but because we know the portrait we're painting today I want it to end up being an 8 by 10. I'm just going to use paper, which is 11 by 8.5, which is standard copy size paper, and that'll give us a nice blank canvas for working. Now, you'll notice that it's oriented in landscape. I want it to be portrait, so all I have to do is use my fingers on the screen to kind of squeeze and pinch and turn. Now, we have a blank canvas. We need to insert a photo to that. So on the top left hand, you'll see a wrench, which is just the symbol for some tools that are in Procreate. The first action that's already highlighted is add. We want to insert a photo. So we're going to touch that. It automatically goes to my camera roll. And in my camera roll, I have a photo that I have already edited. And I mean, I have cropped it. I have put it into grayscale. It is ready to work with. It is the appropriate ratio for an 8 by 10. And I'm just going to take my fingers and push and pull until it just about fills this piece of paper. I want a little bit of a margin, and that works just fine. Next step, we need a pencil or a brush. Now, if we go to the top right-hand corner, the first icon you see is a brush. If you touch that, Procreate has a large brush library. You can actually import additional brushes, but there are plenty here to choose from. For this particular task, I like to choose inking and technical pen. So that's what we're going to work with today. Next step is to decide what color I want my pen to write with. If you go to the right corner, there's a circle. Mine is red because I've selected red as my brush color. There are a variety of colors that you can choose from. I happen to like red when I'm working on a black and white photo because it's easier to see. So we have a brush, we have a color, and now we need to decide how fat is our line going to be. So there are two slide bars on the left-hand side of your screen. The top slide bar lets us choose the size of the brush. So if I choose 100%, I get a fairly fat line, which wouldn't work when I get into these tiny details around her eye. So, and here's a quick trick. If you don't like a line, just touch the screen and it'll go away. I like my brush size to be somewhere around 10%, so 10 or 11%. Gives me a nice fine line that I can work with. The bottom slide bar is for opacity. So I want a line that is not transparent at all. So I've selected 100% opacity, which means I've got a solid line. All right, we are pretty much ready to go. Here's the next step is probably the most important. We have a canvas, which we're going to call layer 1. But we don't want to draw on this canvas because if we do, we've changed our photo. So if you look in the top right-hand corner, there are two overlapping squares. This is where you can add layers. So let's select that. And we can see that layer 1 is our original photo. And I want to add a layer. And this layer is going to be where I draw my lines. So if you imagine that you have a photograph and you've taken a clear piece of acetate and laid over the top of that photograph, you can write all over the acetate. You've not ruined the photograph. And that's how layers work. All right. Photo is in a canvas. We have added a layer. I am always double checking to make sure I'm working in layer 2. And now we can begin to trace our subject. I'm not going to worry about a lot of the detail over here. I'm mostly concerned about the accuracy of my drawing of her face. So I want this a little bit bigger so that I can work on it. Anytime I want to change the size, I can just pinch and pull and twist. So let's get it large enough that we can see where some of these lines are. We're not going to worry about all those fine wispy hairs, but what I want to do is take my time and trace right along the edge of her face. Now, I find that this is almost meditative. So take your time, go slow, think about what you're tracing. I'm thinking that her forehead is slightly curved. The brow bone proceeds just a little bit before the eye socket indents. This indicates where her cheekbone is. And if I never use this line drawing to trace from, it doesn't matter. I've still built some muscle memory about the shape and structure of a face. Now, if you look, I got a little crazy on this line, so I'm just going to tap and it's going to go away so I can do it again. And like I said, slow is good. And let's see. Her neck, oops, I accidentally switched to eraser. I want to make, so if you go to write and there's nothing happening, it's because you've gone to eraser. Let's go back to brush and get this neck. Ooh, dear, dear, dear. Something's happened with my size of my brush as well. Let's go back here to 10%. Here's her neck coming down. That's still too big. What have we done here? Oh, that's because it's changed brushes on me. Let's go back to inking. Let's go to technical pen. Let's get rid of that. All right, now we're back in business. Here's her neck coming down into her t-shirt. And if I want to double check, because there's some confusing shapes here, I can go in, get rid of the photo for a minute. I don't know. We may have to come back to that one. All right, I also find that it's easier for me to pull the pen than to push the pen, so I'm just going to turn her face here so that I can come around this side. I can see the top of her shoulder here. Let's get that line in. As you can see, I'm not going real fast on this. This is a slow and steady wins the race kind of process. Let's get the top of her shirt in here. Okay, this line just about disappears into the top of her t-shirt or dress. We've got a little bit of a line that indicates there's some binding around the top. And we can, again, as I said, I'm much better when I can pull the pen toward me as opposed to pushing. Let's get the front of her dress here. All right. Where to? Now, here's an important line. This little line here lets us know that her arm is kind of in front of her dress. All right. Pinching, pulling all the while. I'm going to finish tracing this, but I want to speed it up so that you're not having to watch this laborious task. However, I will say to you that I think one of the most important things about this process is going slow, letting yourself become very familiar with shape and line of the subject that you're going to paint. So I'll catch up with you in just a bit. Okay, we have a line drawing that's going to give us the basis to trace from. A couple of things I want to point out. You can't see her pupil, and in this eye, let's go back to the photo for a minute, you can see there's a very dark shadow. She has a very small area of white here in her eye. If you can't see it, don't paint it. And that's kind of an important rule. I didn't draw all of her hair, but what I did do was make sure that I'm clear about the direction that this hair is going. Now, she has some very interesting shadow shapes. I don't think I'm going to put those in my tracing because I just saw a hair. I want to make sure I get a direction for. I can freelance those. I'm not too worried about it. Let's go back. Let's get rid of the photo again so we can see what's going on. She's actually holding cherries in her hand that we can't see, and that's an important part of the story. So with the photo out of the way, I'm going to fill her little hand with some cherries. I want this one to be one, two, three, four, five. Let's put one more here just for giggles, and we can give some of them some stems. I did trace this particular bunch of leaves and cherries because they're very distinct in the painting, and I think they add to the story. But now that I can see where I've added my own cherries, this stem that comes down, this twig, is kind of in the way. So let's get the eraser and just get rid of that. We don't really need it, and if we do need it when we're painting it, because it's a dark, we can throw it in. But these other cherries, some of these other cherries need a stem. I like things that crisscross. And if we want another stem, we could. We don't want them all in the same place. Okay, that's enough. That kind of reads cherries. Again, I didn't want to trace all of this other stuff, but I do want this accurate rendering of these 3 cherries in a bunch with these leaves. That's enough. I can make the rest of this very loose and take advantage of watercolor. But this helps to set the stage. I'm also realizing now that I don't really need to have this stem in there. When we're ready to paint it, if we decide we need it, we'll drop it in. Let's see if there's anything else there were some leaves here that seemed important. I'm not so sure that they are. Okay. Hair is wispy. We've added just enough hair to remind us where they're going to flow. It looks like here we need some that, golly, I keep losing my pen. We want to kind of crisscross some of those. We can use those hairs to help design. Let me go back to my photo. Here's the back side of her arm. I did miss that. And if you find it helpful to make note of where the folds are, that's fine. They're probably something you could eyeball. This is a minor detail that we might want to include, and that's the binding around the armhole. Now, one thing I would like to point out, let me get rid of the photo again. That's layer 1. You can see there are places where I use dotted line. I do that to remind myself that I want this to be a soft edge. Little girls do not have hard red lines along their lips. The same with these shadow shapes under her eyes. I just needed a reminder to make sure that that line is suggested, but it doesn't have to be a hard and fast line. All right, that gives us a nice line drawing from which we can trace. So the next step is, let's go back to Tools. And let's see, we want to, actually, we were working in Add. Now we want to go to Share, which is the 1, 2, 3rd button over. And we want to share this as a JPEG. A JPEG is just a photo file. So when I click that, it has exported my picture, my drawing, as a photo. And I want to save it to my photo files. Oops, my mistake. I want to save the image, which will put it on my camera roll. Okay, export successful. All right, we're now all set to go to our camera roll and print out this particular image, which will give us the basis for a nice tracing. We've gotten rid of all the extra lines that can get in the way. We've added some things that help tell the story. And we've included one piece of information that will also help tell the story. We worked on Procreate to create a line drawing and then sent this as an image to the camera roll. and printed it off. So now we have this nice paper copy of our line drawing. The red lines that we used to trace the reference image show up just great. I've taped it down to my table surface, and I'm going to lay a piece of tracing paper over it because now we're going to trace our red lines onto this tracing paper so that we can ultimately transfer it to watercolor paper. Again, a lot of people have said to me they feel like this is a very laborious and repetitive process, but I have to say that for me, I find that it makes me slow down. It forces me to pay attention to the major lines and shapes that I'm going to be painting. So again, when I go over them one more time, I'm just reinforcing in my brain what these major shapes feel like and what they look like. So I'm using Daler Rowney tracing paper. It's a high quality tracing paper. I've used cheaper versions. I believe the arts and crafts stores have their own brand. It's not quite as translucent as this, and so it's kind of worth the extra penny. I've also used vellum, which is super, but it's a lot more pricey. So this seems to work just fine. You could also use a light box. I had a light box. I don't use it. For one thing, I could only do paintings that were this size, so it was limited in its use. You could take your line drawing and tape it to a window outside of which the sun is shining brightly and use sunlight as your light source to shine through the paper. That works great. I do that quite often because I can do a fairly large piece of paper on a sliding glass door. The other option is to use a digital projector. Again, I've tried that. I just find that the old-fashioned way seems to work best for me. I have a little more control over my lines when I can work on a flat tabletop versus the projector where I'm trying to trace straight up and down against a wall with my paper taped to the wall. So this is a process that works for me. It may not work for you, but again, I find it helpful. At the risk of sounding repetitive, there's no need to hurry. This is about slow and steady. We're thinking about what these shapes do, why this bump is here, because it sets the stage for this eye socket, this swell in her cheek that indicates where that cheekbone is. As we come down here, especially on a little girl, her nice rounded chin. And I am using, my favorite little marker. This is a Sharpie pen. It's actually felt tip and it's permanent. So I buy these by the box from Amazon because they're great for tracing. I can't, this won't smear now. It's permanent. I also use it in my travel sketchbooks and journaling because, again, it's permanent. And the good news is if I lose it, unlike a fountain pen, which is an expensive investment, this is relatively inexpensive, and it's not heartbreaking if you find that it fell out of your purse or your portfolio. So I'm just going to take my time and trace over all these lines. One thing I want to do before I get too far along is mark that this is the front. We're going to be adding graphite to the back, and I don't want to get confused about where I'm working. So I'm going to proceed with making my lines. I am going to speed up the camera a little bit here so that you're not snoozing while I do the slow and steady work of recreating my line drawing. All right, it looks like I have traced all my red lines. So if we look now, we've got on tracing paper. A nice black line that we can use for transferring. So let me put this aside for a minute and we'll get ready for the next step, which is to add some graphite to the back of this so that we can transfer it. All right, so I have my tracing now. I don't need this tape anymore. We can get rid of that. The black line is on the front, and I've marked that because now we're going to turn it over. And with a pencil, we're going to go over all the lines that we can see through the paper with a pencil. Now, I'm using a 4B, which is relatively soft. You can use a 2B, but you don't want to use a pencil that's too hard. What you're doing is loading up graphite on the back of these lines so that when you turn it over and press on them, it will transfer to the watercolor paper. And yes, you could use graphite paper. It is not a favorite of mine. I find that the lines are too dark. They are difficult to erase, and I just kind of like this old-fashioned way. So here we go again. I'm going over my lines again. And this, for me personally, is not wasted effort. I feel like I am reinforcing in my brain the shape of her face, the shape of her mouth, the shape of her nose, eyes, etc. So here's how this works. You don't have to be fancy. You just want to take your pencil and basically kind of scribble over that line. Again, you're loading up graphite on the back so that you can, when you turn this over and lay it on your watercolor paper, it will transfer. So again, I'm going to say goodbye for a minute and speed this up on the camera so that you're not, again, going to sleep watching me cover these lines up with graphite. And I'll see you in a bit. All right, I've covered all of my lines with graphite, and I noticed a couple of things as I was working my way along this line drawing. I neglected to put in her gum line, and that's important. I don't typically paint separate teeth in a portrait. However, in a child who's got a missing tooth and a lot of baby teeth, they're part of the story, and so it's important to capture that. Also, young children's gum line tends to come down farther within their teeth. I'm not too worried about it. If it was something that concerned me, I could lay this back over my red line drawing and retrace that and transfer, but I am pretty sure I can draw that in. The other thing I'm wondering about is, I like this bunch of cherries. It helps tell the story, but I'm wondering if maybe when I transfer this to the paper that I might want to move it down and over a little bit. I don't know whether I'm happy about it being so close right here to her face. I don't have to make a decision about that right now. But again, by going over these lines, I notice things that I may have missed the first time. And one other thing I noticed, is I'm always on the lookout for tangents. Tangents are lines that intersect in a way that doesn't feel natural. So we're looking for connecting and overlapping shapes, but this line is a tangent. it comes right into where the stem is. When I transfer this to my paper, I'm going to make this cherry larger on that side and a little smaller on this side so that I avoid that tangent. Now I got to be careful here that I haven't created another one, but again, when we transfer, we can deal with that. All right, so we can, we're ready for the next step, which is to transfer this to a piece of watercolor paper. So hang on and I'll be back in a minute. Alrighty, I have a piece of watercolor paper here. This is Arches, Arche, as the French say. It is 1/6 of a full sheet, which gives me a nice format for an 8x10 painting. It gives me a big fat margin, but I'm not too worried about that. I can always make good use of the little strips that I cut off. But it is cold press, I should add. I have found that rough 140-pound cold press is great for a portrait. I'm not quite brave enough for hot press, but maybe that's in my future. I would recommend that you not use 140-pound rough unless you're painting an old man with a scruffy beard or a man with a beard. It is just a little too, there's a little too much tooth to it to render a child or an adult's skin in a smooth fashion. So I want to get this piece of paper in a good position here for you and for me. And I'm going to do the same thing I did before. I want to tape it down. I don't want it to move. Once I get started, I need to make sure it's staying in place. All right, tape down. And now I have my black line drawing on the front that I made from my red transfer from Procreate. And on the back, I've laid graphite. And I'm just going to lay this on the piece of paper. And I've got enough wiggle room here that I can kind of play. Here's the top edge of my paper and the top edge of her hair. I want to come down just a little bit. If I have to cut off anything, I'd just as soon it be at the bottom of the page, I think. All right. And I'm going to add a little bit of tape to this so that it doesn't move. Once I get going, I want to keep my marks in the same place. All right. Now, I've switched to a red pen. The reason being is if I go over these lines with a black pen, it's very difficult to see. I don't use a pencil to go over these lines because the point dulls. If you look at my 4B pencil and look at the end of it, it would make a very wide line. And when I get into precise areas like this, I need something a little more specific and a little more precise. So a ballpoint pen works great. It doesn't have to be red. I just happen to have this handy. And what we're going to do is go right over our black line that we drew with the permanent Sharpie. And when I press down on that line, I don't have to press real hard either. When I press down on that line, the graphite that I put on the back is transferred to my watercolor paper. And that's exactly what I want to happen. So let me show you what I mean. The graphite that I put on the back, when I press down, gets transferred to the watercolor paper. Okay? Now, I'm going to proceed with going over all my lines. And guess what? I'm going to sound like a broken record here. I have another opportunity to reinforce shape and line. So I don't see this tedious at all. If you weren't here with me, I'd probably put on a little smooth jazz and let the music kind of take over while I go over these lines. But I'll check back with you in a minute, and I am going to speed the video up so that you're not dozing on me while I transfer all these lines to my watercolor paper. See you in a bit. All right, I've gone over all my lines with a ballpoint pen. I've transferred the graphite to my watercolor paper, but I want to do a double check, make sure I didn't miss anything important. If I missed a bow, I'm not too worried about it, or one of these lines in her hair. Again, when I went over this again, I noticed some things that I think I want to adjust. So that's going to be our next step. And let's get our tracing out of the way. And I want to bring our photograph back so that we can double check and reinforce any lines that seem to have gone astray. So let's see what we've got here. All right, so here's our young lady. I'm going to move her over to the side. You're not going to be able to see her, but I can see her. You can see if we had traced all of this, it is so busy that we would have detracted from the fact that she is the star. Anything with eyes, human or animal, typically that's your focal point. Our eye tends to go there. The other thing, I only put in a few of these wispy hairs. Again, if I put them all in, it starts to look contrived. I need some because they kind of add to the story that she's outside and she's been picking cherries. But my job now is to bounce back and forth between my photo and my drawing on my watercolor paper to see if there are any lines that I've missed, if there's anything that I want to correct, because once I start putting paint down, it's a little bit too late. So I've switched now to just a regular number 2 pencil. This one happens to be a 2 HB, which means it's relatively hard. If there are lines that I need to fix, I want to be able to do it with this. One thing that's bothering me a little bit is I do like to work in terms of odd numbers. 1, 2, 3 cherries, 1, 2, 3, 4 leaves. This leaf that I kind of tucked in there in the back, to me, is distracting, and I just don't think I need it. So I'm going to take a kneaded eraser and get rid of it. Some of the lines that I want to make sure I'm really clear about, obviously, are in her features, and we don't want to lose track of those. Don't want my lines to be too dark because, boy, once they're covered up with watercolor paint, they're a little bit difficult to get rid of. Some of them you can, and some of them you can't. All right. But I do need it to stand up to several washes. I want to double check her eyes. That's usually the place where I want to make sure my lines are reinforced, because these are critical to making sure that she reads not only human, but little girl. If you remember, it was very dark in here. And the same on this eye. We don't really see much of the corner here. I put these lines, I like lines that overlap. And I want to have some of these light hairs come across this dark eyeball. Even if the rest of the hair doesn't show. If it shows here, your brain, as the viewer, is going to say, there's hair coming over here. The other thing about our eyes, we do not, in the photograph, see the pupil. So it is very, very dark. This is very dark in our reference image. But what we do see are some catch lights. So I want to make sure that I don't forget those. And I think I want to kind of put them right here. I don't want them to be exactly the same. If we could see her pupil, it would be about right there. All right. Now, when I went to change direction here, I left a nice big juicy pencil mark on my pretty paper. Okay. All right. The other thing I'm a little bit concerned about is this thumb. And we're there. That's a little bit better. All right. We are close to the painting process now. The next task that we have is going to be to decide on our color palette. And when we, if we go back to the original photograph, reference image, before we made it grayscale, we can get an idea of the tones that we want. We know the cherries are kind of yellowy, a real warm yellow, almost to orange. And I know that I can use a warm yellow and orange in creating a nice flesh tone. So those two are a match. I also know there's a lot of green over here. And if I've already determined my yellow, which I'm going to want a warm yellow, then I need to find a blue that would work for some of these sky holes that we're going to leave here and would mix with the yellow to give me a nice green. All right, so we'll come back to that in a minute, but for now, we are close. Before we start putting paint on this, I want to take a kneaded eraser and pick up any of the extra graphite, because gray is a value, and if you have graphite dust on your paper, you're just creating one more thing for that pigment to mix with and muddy your color. So you can take a kneaded eraser and roll it across your paper, and it'll pick up any of that graphite dust. It also helps to pick up any extra that you... This hair is bothering me. We don't want it to come down in here to these cherries. I want to get rid of that. And because I do like overlaps, I'm going to let it go this way. There, that's better. I like that better. All right. All right. You know what? While we have this available, I am not a big fan of masking fluid. However, because so much of this is fine blonde hair, I'm going to take a chance and lay in a few of the hairs just so that we don't lose them, especially the ones that come over her eyebrow and her eye. So give me just a minute to get my masking fluid kit, and I'll show you how we're going to handle that. We could do a whole lesson on masking fluid. I have all kinds of tools that I've collected for applying masking fluid. Some of them, to me, are not worth a darn. Others, cheap as can be and seem to do the job. So let me get this out of the way. I put a little bit of masking fluid in a contact lens case, which allows me to just dip and get a tiny little bit, because it does dry up if the air gets to it. This is just a plastic toothpick. It is probably one of my favorite tools for doing very fine lines. Let's get these little catch lights in, because again, I start slinging paint. I don't want to worry about, oops, I covered up the little white dot in her eye. Yes, I could go back with gouache, or I could take a craft knife and scrape them out, but this is just easier. Now, for these hairs, I want as fine a line. I don't care if it skips. I just want something to block the paint. I'm not trying to be real careful. If I get a fat end, I'm going to take the toothpick and smoosh it out a little bit. Smoosh is a technical term. All right. Here's the problem with masking fluid. Once you get going, it's like you think, oh, just one more. Maybe one more here. These do not have to be perfect. What they're doing more than anything is establishing the direction that the hair is going. Oh, now there's one of those fat ends. I want to get rid of that. And I can just scrape that out. All right. She's got some of these come over her ear, which is important. Overlapping lines are always good. And got one coming here. Let's get a few more of the. Oh, I just broke the tip of my very expensive masking fluid tool. Oh, well. All right. I guess I'll have to find a source for those. All right, let's see if we can't. Like I said, if it skips, that's fine. We're not, I do want it to go over that eye though, because that's going to help me establish that it's set back in her head. Now there are some up here on the top of her head that we can, oh, bless your heart. All right, you're almost done. Just hold in there for just a minute, buddy. See what I mean? You get started with this and you don't want to stop. It just seems like such a good idea until you're done and you take it off and go, well, that looks exactly like I came in here with too much masking fluid. All right, enough. That has to dry before we can put any paint on it. There isn't any place else in here where I need to have the white of the paper. Other places where I have light areas for her hair, we're going to use a very light value of raw sienna. And we can also come back in and lift with an eradicator brush. But we are pretty much set now to get ready to paint. For now, this has to dry. So that's going to be our next little video will be how do we go from this to beginning to lay paint on it. So just to reinforce, we used Procreate to give us a nice line drawing that was relatively precise because we drew right over the top of a black and white photo. We printed that out, traced it, and then used our tracing to transfer the image to watercolor paper. We've gone back in and reinforced. Ooh, there's a line that could stand a little reinforcement. Reinforced our lines that may have gotten a little bit fuzzy in the process. And we added a little bit of masking fluid just to hold some of those white hairs and the catch lights in her eye. All right, we'll have to leave you now till you dry. Bye. I hope you found this helpful. If so, please take just a minute and give me a thumbs up. Also, if you feel like subscribing, that would be great. I will tell you up front that I'm not a prolific poster, so when I have a problem that I'm trying to solve, oftentimes I'll document it in the hopes that my solution might help someone else. The other thing I'd like to say is I recognize that this process of using Procreate to create a line drawing that you can then trace and transfer may not suit you, and that is perfectly fine. Each of us find our own ways of solving problems that we deal with in our creative practice. And last but not least, there is no substitute for drawing and for drawing well and for spending time improving your drawing skills. Tracing is a tool. It's a tool when you use it because you know you can draw your subject and you're using tracing as a way to be a little more efficient. However, if you're tracing and because you can't draw your subject, then we have to admit that it's a crutch. And I think we can all benefit by spending more time working on our drawing and sketching. The better you draw, the better you paint. So take care and thanks for watching.